You're inside the Mom Stuff Coffee Shop, a podcast dedicated to helping you get back up again, turning your pain into power, turning your trauma into triumph. I am your host, KK Smith, and I find joy in helping you get back up again. This podcast holds a space for you to grow, heal, and connect like you never have before. So grab your coffee and step inside the Mom Stuff Coffee Shop. About today's show, today we are joined by author and former radio host and an advocate for victims of domestic violence and survivors of domestic violence, Nigel Beckles. He is from the United Kingdom, and he's going to talk about decluttering our lives with first kicking out unwanted guests. And one of the main unwanted guests in our lives is narcissism. But first, he's going to tell us all about his amazing book. And at the end of the show, you're going to be able to purchase his book in the show notes. So welcome to the show.
Hello, KK. Thank you for having me.
So I am super excited to start this show and to learn more about your book and about your purpose and also about narcissistic behavior. So first, can you tell us something about your book?
Well, my first book was published in 2015. It's called How to Avoid Making the Big Relationship Mistakes. And the motivation for writing it, initially, I have made many mistakes myself. Many of them, if not all of them. So it really started off doing research to kind of discover for myself where had I gone wrong in my previous relationships. And then it kind of morphed and got deeper and deeper. And it's kind of like, well, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? And I was down in the rabbit hole for 5 years, because it was 5 years research it took me before it was published. So the first part is really about self-development, things like emotional intelligence, healthy personal boundaries. Second part of the book gets into more of the relationship arena in terms of, do's and don'ts, red flags to look out for when you're dating, how to use online dating safely, because online dating is now the big thing. It's been the big thing for a while. So it's really a best practice guide. That's what I call it. Because with the relationships, it's not always a question of one size fits all. But I do advocate best practice because in the final analysis, prevention is better than cure. Relationships are very easy to get into, not always that easy to get out of.
Absolutely. So you mentioned red flags. So what are some of the major red flags in a relationship that women and men can look out for?
Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about dating. So in terms of dating and red flags, there's something called love bombing. So if someone's trying to rush you into a relationship too quickly, or they quickly profess to be your soulmate and they are saying, undying love, or they want to move in quickly. Those are some of the basic red flags. In terms of a relationship, unfortunately, when we talk about abuse and abusers are rarely abusive at first. In fact, they can be very charismatic and charming during the dating phase. It's only when the person gets involved, then they may start to see some red flags that they hadn't bargained for. So, and some of the red flags are not necessarily that obvious. Say you've got a partner who sulks if they don't get their own way, or you've got a partner who gives you the silent treatment if they don't get their own way, or they throw a tantrum if they don't get what they want. Well, those are red flags as well.
Can those things be developed, or are those things that you say, run, get out of this? Because what I know from relationships is that what I tell my children, my grown children, is that if you see those extreme behaviors, you have to be working constantly on yourself. You don't really necessarily have the wherewithal to develop somebody else. So that person should be working on their stuff just as much as you're working on yours. So would you advise a person that is, if 70% of everything that you like and they have these red flags, what would be your advice?
Well, it depends on the red flag, doesn't it? If you've got a partner who's physically violent or physically abusive, or and that's part of their 30%. That's not very nice. Well, you still need to leave, 30% or not. In abusive relationships, there's something called intermittent reinforcement. And really what that means in layman's terms is that the abuser's nice to you sometimes, and then they're nasty to you. But then the person on the receiving end, they can get biochemically addicted to the good times. So they end up always chasing that honeymoon period when the abuser was nice to them. So then the intermittent reinforcement then leads to something called trauma bonding, where the person being abused feels bonded to their partner. And the term trauma bonding comes from an incident in Stockholm. It's also called Stockholm Syndrome. And basically in that situation, back in the 70s, there was a bank robbery and hostages were taken. The siege lasted about 2 weeks. After it was all over, 2 of the female captors, one posted bail for one of the hostage takers. One of the other female captives wanted to marry one of their captive takers. So basically they were bonded to people who had effectively abused them. But again, in that situation, the hostage takers were nice to them sometimes, and then obviously horrible to them to sometimes as well. So it's a big problem in abusive relationships. And the major problem is that many people who are trauma bonded don't realize they are trauma bonded. So, and I started a support group 9 years ago for victims and survivors of domestic abuse, and I belong to other groups as well. And something that I see is very common is a person posting saying, oh, I really miss him, I really miss her, I know they abused me, but I want them back. So logic would say to you and I, well, why would you miss someone who's abused you? You should be happy that they're out of your life. But it's because they're trauma bonded. And sadly, in that situation, the person who's been abused can actually seek comfort from the person who abused them in the first place. So it's a vicious circle.
Now, is that based on the gaping hole that is within the person? Because sometimes we're trying to fill these holes from childhood, from things that we didn't have growing up. And some people just didn't have love and care. And when it shows up, it can be so dysfunctional. But they can't see that because the need outweighs the dysfunction.
Well, it depends, because it depends on a person's childhood. So, for example, there's something called codependency. It's now called self-love deficit disorder because people feel the term codependency has a certain amount of stigma to it. But say, for example, you're a child is brought up in a home where one or both parents have got mental health issues, or they've got drug addiction, for example. Those type of scenarios, the child can actually end up being the caretaker or the caregiver. So effectively the roles are reversed. So you're brought up caring for your parent, but then that child becomes an adult and they may well have tendencies to caretake and caregive their partner, which may not be necessarily a major problem. Obviously, it's good to care for your partner, but if you're in a situation where you're always giving and you're with an abuser, because abusers are about taking. So if you're always giving, they'll be taking from you all day long.
Wow, that's such good clarity and insight. So next, we're going to move into one of the main subjects that you talk about is narcissism. So can you clearly define what is narcissism?
Well, the first thing to say about narcissism is that we're all narcissists. We all have narcissism. There's something called healthy narcissism, and there's nothing wrong with having high self-esteem, being confident, liking nice clothes, having a nice place to live. Those are all parts of healthy narcissism. When it's toxic narcissism, that's when it's destructive to other people. So for a person to be diagnosed as a narcissist, they'd have to go and get assessed. So there are 9 main traits that a narcissist is diagnosed on. Say, for example, arrogance, or envious of others, or assume others are envious of them. But if someone was to Google the 9 traits of a narcissist, it's easy to find. So basically, if someone is diagnosed with 5 or more of those personality characteristics, they will be officially diagnosed as a narcissist, because effectively it's measured on a spectrum. So if they've got 5 traits out of 9, they'll be officially diagnosed. But if they've got 6, they're going to be more toxic. Then you're going from 6 to 9. Obviously, the higher up the scale they are, the more toxic they will be. But the problem that we have in wider society is that the majority of people are not diagnosed. So there are a lot of people out there. They estimate between 5 and 15% of the general population has an undiagnosed personality disorder.
And how does narcissism play out in relationships? And how can narcissism ruin a relationship?
Well, one of the traits, well, there's a few traits that are very damaging to relationships. So if we look at a lack of empathy, which is one of the 9 criteria, a severe lack of empathy. So if you've got a partner who lacks empathy, well, you've got a problem. The other one is they're extremely selfish. So again, if you've got a partner who's exceedingly selfish and only thinking about themselves, well, that doesn't lend itself well to a healthy relationship, does it? The other one for me would be they are exceedingly vindictive. So again, if they don't get their own way, or you don't do what they want you to do, then that's going to be a problem. The thing with narcissists basically is, when we're looking at relationships, is that their relationships are transactional, which means they enter relationships on the basis of what can they get out of it. That is why they go into relationships in the first place. The other issue you're going to have with a narcissist is that they are notorious for cheating. You know, they're very rarely faithful in their relationships. And basically they go through a particular relationship cycle. So the cycle is idealize, devalue, discard. So when they meet a person, they'll put them on a pedestal, shower them with love and attention, etc., which is what suckers the person in. Then they will begin to devalue the person. They'll start finding things wrong with that person. Nothing wrong with the other person. It's just the cycle they go through. So they'll start finding fault. And then they will discard, which basically means that they leave the relationship, often not providing any closure. They'll just leave, just disappear. So that's the narcissistic relationship cycle. Part of that cycle can also be the Hoover. Because we call it the Hoover, or it is called the Hoover, when they try and suck you back in. So they could leave, and 2 months, 2 years later, they may decide to return. And you may not have had any contact with them in that time. They will just pop back up. I interviewed a lady on my podcast series. She was involved with a narcissist. And we know he's a narcissist because he's ex-army. So he had to get diagnosed on a psychological basis before he could get his benefits. And he was diagnosed as a narcissist, but she didn't know what a narcissist was at that time. And she was involved with him, and he disappeared for 15 years. And he returned. And sadly, she took him back. And the wedding was arranged, invitations sent out, hotel rooms booked. And at the last minute, he said, "Oh, sorry, I can't do this." And he disappeared again and left her to deal with the aftermath, basically.
Wow. So narcissism, the foundation is selfishness.
The foundation of narcissism is not agreed, because if you read up on what the experts say, some will say nature, it's how it's in their DNA, it's genetics. Some will say it's nurture, it's how they're brought up. Some people will say it's a combination of the two. My personal view is narcissism is caused by arrested development, because effectively they are very immature, emotionally immature.
Okay.
So you're dealing with someone who's emotionally arrested at around 5 to 7 years old. Some people say younger, but I go for 5 to 7 years old. So the bottom line is you are dealing with a child operating in an adult body. That doesn't mean to say they're not intelligent. They can hold down great jobs, be president of the United States, some would say. But the bottom line is you're dealing with a child operating in an adult body. Because it's not a question of they lack intelligence, they lack emotional intelligence.
Emotional intelligence. And that is so important. Emotional intelligence runs our entire life. It trumps book knowledge. It trumps book knowledge, because that's what people see before the book knowledge is the intelligence. How are you treating people? Are you selfish? Are you condescending? Are you a narcissist?
So, well, basically, do you have consideration for other human beings?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, narcissists don't. Everything's me.
Me. And that's the question I was going to ask you, how to recognize narcissism within ourselves. So it is a constant vie for attention. And is it also based in everything has to go my way?
Yes, everything has to go their way, unless they'll probably throw a tantrum. I'm glad you mentioned attention, actually, because that is their addiction. And actually, the term is narcissistic supply, which is really just a long-winded way of saying basically they are attention whores.
Okay.
Whether they be men or women, because attention is their supply, just like a heroin addict needs heroin, or a crack addict needs crack, which is why, as I mentioned before, they're very prone to cheat.
Very prone to cheat. So a narcissist is not safe on social media. Based on cheating, because boy, the dating scene has really changed. So you get mad at someone and then you're a narcissist, you hop on social media and it's over. I'm out of here for the night. You know what I'm saying?
Well, social media is actually their playground to a large extent, because you have to look at the legend of Narcissus. So Narcissus is basically a Greek mythology where this guy's walking past a lake and he sees a reflection of himself in the lake and he falls in love with his own reflection, so much so he falls into the lake and he drowns. So that is where the term, that's what it's based on. Basically a person who's self-absorbed in love with themselves. So I've noticed, over the years, you go on someone's Facebook page on their profile. Now, if they're posting 4, 5, 6 selfies a day, you're more likely or not looking at a potential narcissist. And there's research to back that up. Right. There's research that tells us that, well, narcissists are more likely to use social media than normal people. Narcissists are more likely to post selfies of themselves, whether it be on Facebook, Instagram, etc. So there's research, because my books rely on research. My books rely on science, basically. So I don't just kind of like come out with my opinions as such. The way I look at it, there are 2 types of opinion in the world. They're either informed or they're uninformed. And I like to, especially as people rely on me to give them advice and, raise awareness about abusive relationship, I have to make sure that what I'm saying to people is on point. But I always say as well, do your own research. I always say that all the time. Right.
And after, it's been probably about a decade now, probably a little over a decade that I've been studying the ego. And a lot of what you're saying, the ego seeks attention. So the ego, everybody has an ego.
Yeah.
Everybody has one. But how can we start to dismantle the unwanted guests of the narcissist within ourselves if this conversation has brought light to the fact that maybe some of us are narcissists, maybe our listeners? How can you dismantle that unwanted guest if you see that in yourself?
Well, the first thing I would say is that, we will have an ego. But when you're dealing with a narcissist or a sociopath or a psychopath for that matter, you're dealing with someone whose ego is out of control. The ego has to be satisfied, right? So the other problem you're going to have, if you're dealing with a narcissist, they don't think there's anything wrong with them. So I'm in groups sometimes and people will say, oh, I think I'm the narcissist. Well, if a person is thinking they are a narcissist, they're very likely not a narcissist, because a narcissist hasn't got the capacity for that self-awareness, for that self-analysis.
Right.
Part of that is because they're self-absorbed. Part of that is because they think they're the best thing since sliced bread. They don't think there's anything wrong with them. They think they're perfect, basically. So you're not going to, if a person is saying, well, I think I'm a narcissist, no, that's unlikely. Whereas a narcissist will deny viciously that they're a narcissist or that there's anything wrong with them.
And you know what? As I mentioned earlier, the fractured childhood, but that doesn't always have to be. They could come from a very holistic childhood and all of their needs were met, and maybe they were rewarded for going out of their way to be perfect, to be, before we had social media, we had narcissists. So, there could be traits in different people that didn't necessarily come from brokenness. And you see narcissism show up to where everything has to be my way.
Well, I'm very glad you said that, because there are some experts who will say that, the narcissism in children is caused by abandonment issues, for example. But one other idea is, which I agree with, is that spoiling a child can also create a narcissist. Because as you just mentioned, right, if a child is overindulged and told they can do nothing wrong and given everything that they want, they can grow into adults who think, well, that's how life works. Right. I always get my own way. I always get what I want.
Right.
And I say that with some authority because I have got a half brother who's just like that.
Right.
He was spoiled. And I say spoiled. This is what I've been told by family members on my father's side. He was spoiled rotten, as we would say in the UK. And now he's just a taker. Just a taker and a user, etc. So there isn't a one size fits all as to what causes a narcissist, but they are dangerous people. They are very dangerous people. And one of my favorite sayings is, the only way to win with a toxic person is not to play. It's that simple. Because when you bear in mind as well that they're very vindictive, there was a case here in Scotland. There was a case in Scotland about 6-7 years ago. A couple were divorced. The wife had care of the children. The husband done something that upset her, and she murdered her 3 children. She drowned the children. And when it went to court, she was diagnosed with various disorders, including narcissistic personality disorder.
Wow. Now, with you talking about diagnosing, what can be done about a narcissist? Is there therapeutic measures, or are there medicinal measures that a narcissist, an extreme narcissist, like we talked about, psychotic, what can be done therapeutically without medication for a narcissist? How can they begin to have a more fulfilling life and begin to be conscious and aware of their behaviors so they don't go down extreme holes?
That's a long road. That's a long road, because at the end of the day, you could be looking at, there's been studies done on this. You could be looking at anything between 5 to 7, 8 years of therapy. So if you've got a partner who's going for therapy, you've got to ask yourself, well, are you really willing to hang around for 5, 6, 7 years without the guarantee that they're going to get better? That's one. And 2, dealing with all the other issues that are going to happen during that time.
Right.
The other issue you have is that narcissists can be very manipulative, and they're well known for manipulating therapists as well. And then the other issue you have is that, say you've got a narcissistic partner and they agree to go to therapy, again, that may be just to buy them time so you don't leave them. So they might say, oh yes, I'll go to therapy, I'll get help, when they have no intention of actually taking it seriously. They are also very well known to compete with a therapist to show that they are smarter than the therapist, basically. So there are a lot of pitfalls when it comes to therapy. And again, as I say, if someone suspects, because I don't advocate unofficially diagnosing someone as a narcissist or anything else. What I do advocate is doing your own research. And If you identify certain red flags or certain behaviors that are not acceptable, then you leave the relationship, because it's not going to get any better. It's just not going to get any better. Now, the other problem you're going to have is if you share children, because co-parenting is another problem. I was supporting a lady earlier today. She's going through a divorce with a potential narcissist. It ticks all the boxes for me. So, she's having some issues. The other problem you've got with abusers in general is, if there are children involved, is parental alienation, where they seek to turn your children against you. So there are a lot of different pitfalls and issues you have to deal with. I mean, if you haven't got children with a partner who's abusive and you decide to leave, well, you can leave, go no contact. And no contact means no contact. That means not stalking their social media. That means not driving by their place. That means not spying on them. No contact. End of. If you have got children with them, then there's something called the grey rock method, where you just keep things very business-like. You don't talk about the relationship or what happened in the past. You just stick to business. So that's the grey rock method. Then you've got something called the yellow rock method, and that is more to do with when you're dealing with the court system. So anything you put in writing, you make sure it's very cordial, it's very polite. You don't, kick off or get angry in writing, because you have to remember, not only is the ex-partner reading what you're saying, his attorney or solicitor, as we would call it here, they're reading your correspondence as well. And they're going to be looking for things to use against you. So those are just different tactics you can use if you're, you have separated from an abusive partner, but you have children with them.
Narcissism, as you described it, is such a scary personality, because like you were saying, it can be vindictive, it can be abusive, it can be even detriment to your own life. Getting into relationships with narcissists, and not just narcissistic men, there can be narcissistic women. I have to have things my way. I have to have things my way.
Oh yes, I've been involved with a few.
Yes, and I've watched. I work with women. I also have a salon, so I work with a lot of women over the years. And we were talking about last week a case where we were watching a case on TV where a young lady, she had won all her life. She won in everything that she did. Well, it was this relationship that she didn't win. And so she ended up killing the young lady and her baby, because simply she couldn't have the man. And it was narcissism on 10, because simply she was a very successful young lady, very beautiful young lady, but because she couldn't have him, she decided to kill them. And I just, it seems like, how do you get away from narcissistic behaviors when you have connected yourself with them? Whether in friendships, whether in relationships, even your children,
Well, if you're dealing with an ex-partner, that can be a challenge in itself, because they are also very well known for stalking. Because you have to realize, in a toxic narcissistic mindset, they look at people as objects.
Yes.
So therefore you are their possession, whether they are with you or not. I mean, have you seen that movie, The Perfect Guy?
Is that with Taraji P. Henson?
Possibly. It came out about 5-6 years ago. But
I think
it's a black movie.
Yes.
And I'll tell you who's in it.
The guy with the green eyes?
Yes.
Yes, I think I saw that.
Yeah. And Morris Chestnut.
Yes, I do.
Yes, yeah. So that's a very good kind of depiction, because again, because she's basically on the rebound, isn't she? So she's with Chestnut, they split up, she meets the other guy on the rebound, then he starts acting very strange, and then she goes back to Chestnut, and then he pursues both of them, stalking, etc. So, but that is not unusual. If you're dealing with someone who's like narcissistic or psychotic or a sociopath, that's not an unusual scenario at all.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for dissecting this subject on narcissism for us. So where can our guests get help if they need to get out of a relationship that's filled with abuse, filled with life-threatening traits? Where can they get help?
Well, for you over there in the US, because obviously you have different states, don't you? So, there are various domestic violence agencies, you can find online. There's lots of help out there, but you have to reach out. For us, unfortunately, in the UK, and I guess for you guys as well, because of COVID, the incidents of domestic abuse have gone up. Because there are a lot of people suffering who are trapped with their abusers because of lockdown, etc.
Right.
On the other side of the coin, the support agencies, their staff are suffering from COVID, so the staff levels have gone down.
Right.
So you've got an increase in demand,
right,
and less support out there.
Right.
And there's even been reports that the actual murders since lockdown in terms of domestic abuse have gone up.
So you have an online community for...
Oh, yeah. My group online, Facebook, it's Reflections on Abusive Relationships.
Reflections on Abusive Relationships.
Yeah. So if you just go on Facebook, put a search in, the group will come up. We've got 21,000 plus members. We've been going for 9 years. So, it'll be 10 years this year. So, but there's plenty of support groups. The good thing about support groups is sometimes for someone who's been in an abusive relationship or still trapped in one for that matter, sometimes it can be difficult for them to explain what's happening to them or what has happened to them.
Yeah.
Because, often people will say, oh, well, why didn't you just leave? Or they'll say, oh, well, I wouldn't put up with that. But until you're in it, you don't know.
Right. Until you're in it, you don't know.
And the other thing I should say quickly about abusive relationships, they can be very insidious. So it's much like if you drop a frog into a cold pot of water, it will swim around quite happily. If you drop a frog into a hot pot of water, it's going to jump straight out. If you drop that frog into a cold pot of water and then heat it up slowly, one cooked frog, because the frog doesn't know what's happening. And that's very similar to abusive relationships. Sometimes you don't know what's happening because it's a slow process.
A slow process.
It can be because in the final analysis, if you're on the dating scene, abusers don't walk up to you with a label on their forehead saying, oh, I'm an abuser, because you'd run the other way, wouldn't you?
Right.
So often they're very charming and charismatic.
Yes.
What suckers you in?
Yeah, the nurturing, the idealizing, the finessing, it can be intoxicating.
And the mirroring. There's something called mirroring, where basically they will pretend to have exactly the same values, beliefs, and interests that you have. So you like pizza? Oh, they like pizza. You like watching horror films on Netflix? Oh, well, I like watching horror films on Netflix. So they will mirror you, which makes you feel comfortable. That's why a lot of survivors will say, oh, I thought I met my soulmate, when really in reality they met themselves. Sounds a bit crazy to say, but the person is just reflecting that person back to them.
Right. Oh, that's a good one. That's a very good awareness for people that they feel something, they say, something's not right here. That's a very good clue.
Well, I always say, trust your intuition. You have to, because sometimes, there aren't any obvious red flags, but your intuition might just say to you, something doesn't feel right here.
Something's not right.
Yeah, I always say to everyone all the time, trust your intuition. I know in my lifetime, there have been times I have ignored my intuition and I have paid.
Yes.
Sometimes dearly.
Yes. This right here is why I ignored my intuition. I fell. I was doing something I didn't have any business doing, and my intuition told me 1,000 times, don't do it. And I fell. And this is a constant reminder, and I thank God for it, because it's keeping me reminded that to trust your intuition. Just trust your intuition. So thank you so much. So I have something to sip on, but before I want to talk about this, I want to wrap this up with this. So basically you're saying trust your intuition And before you get involved with a narcissistic relationship, realize what it's going to cost you, but also be brave enough and have the courage to just leave. Because what I tell my friends and my children is that there are billions of people in this world. Billions. Yes. You do not have to be connected to insanity.
In fact, last I checked, it was 7.3 billion, which is funny because when I hear people are talking about, soulmates, there's only one soulmate for me on the planet. No, there's plenty of people out there. There's lots of people out there.
Yes. So, oh my gosh, what would you encourage young people to look out for? Three things that you would encourage young people to look out for so they do not get connected in narcissistic relationships early in life.
I would say read up on red flags. There's plenty of information out there online. Read up on red flags. Pay attention to someone who loses their temper quickly. Pay attention to someone who is overly selfish. And look out for someone who always wants their own way.
Oh, great tips. Thank you. So the next part, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Now, this is called something to sip on for our guests. So the first question is, what brings you joy?
What brings me joy? This might sound a bit cliched actually, but what brings me joy is actually helping other people, because I don't see the point in having all the information I have and it's not helping somebody else. That doesn't make sense to me. So I enjoy helping other people. I think that's part of being a decent human being, basically. I think, helping others is a good thing, especially people who are in distress. I mean, I'm a certified relationship coach and I get people approaching me who are in abusive situations, but I don't take them on as, I will give them the advice I can give them, but I will refer them to colleagues of mine or people I know who are qualified therapists, for example, because they're equipped to deal with that. Because if you're a coach is a person who helps another person to set goals and achieve them. Okay. A counselor or a therapist is about unpacking the past, unpacking past issues, past traumas, etc.
Yeah.
Heal those and then you can move on. So you see a counselor or therapist first, get that part of the process done, then you can see, a relationship coach or a life coach, because that's about you're setting goals for the future now. You've unpacked your past, you've dealt with that, and now you want to move forward. But you can't move forward if you're carrying a load of emotional baggage with you.
Yes. So they will have to unpack first and then come to you to move forward.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. So the next question is, what are you working on now in your life?
At the moment, I'm just finishing the draft for my second book, which will be called How to Avoid Abusive Relationships, a guide to toxic personalities. And that's taken me 5 years. So I'm just finishing off the draft for that. Obviously, I'm doing my podcasts, which partly I use to help raise awareness about domestic abuse, narcissistic abuse, etc. But I have other guests on as well from a wide variety of backgrounds, authors, coaches, life coaches, therapists, etc. So that's keeping me occupied in the lockdown, as it were, because we're still in lockdown here in the UK.
Okay.
And that's going to be reviewed next week, I believe, 22nd of February. And just keep, raising awareness and helping who I can help.
Very nice. And that's going to be an amazing book, by the way.
Thank you.
What has been your greatest life lesson?
Trust my intuition. That's my greatest lesson. I mean, I've been married, and I'll tell you a story about intuition. I've been married. I got married. Before I got married, my intuition was screaming at me, Nigel, don't do it. Nigel, don't do it. So I spoke to some friends, as you do, and I said, oh, Nigel, don't worry. It's just cold feet. It's just pre-wedding nerves. Then I got married. After I got married, I felt worse than before I got married. I left within a year. Then after I left, my wife, or my ex-wife, said, she's pregnant with my child. Because of my background, she knew I wouldn't abandon a child of mine. So anyway, to cut a long story short, yeah, then I took her to court to get access. I was having him every other weekend, and then she overplayed her hand. So I had the child DNA tested. And this is in the days of, this is not Maury, where it's like, oh, you just get the swab, the saliva. No, back in those days, it's a blood test to test for the DNA. You have to wait for the results. So you can't phone anybody. You can't talk to anybody. You have to wait for those 4 weeks until that envelope lands on your mat. And that was 4 weeks. Then when the results arrived, it wasn't mine. Now, I could have saved myself all of that grief if I'd listened to my intuition in the first place. So that's my biggest lesson for intuition. So since then, I pay much more attention. So if I get a feeling that something's not right, because I'm very much an evidence-based kind of guy. I like evidence. Like a lot of guys, I guess. I want to, what's the evidence? But your intuition doesn't work like that. Your intuition will warn you, and then it will show you the evidence afterwards. That's how it works with me. Because when I'm following my intuition, I haven't got any evidence. I haven't got anything to base that decision on. It's like, well, I don't feel right about this. Something don't feel right. Something feels off. So let me not pursue this route because something feels off. And then down the road, you do get the evidence, or I do get the evidence. So I know my intuition works.
Now, based on intuition, will our intuition ever be wrong?
I don't believe so personally, because I believe your intuition is a message or messages from your soul.
I want to just run down the street off. I believe that so much. I believe that is your soul. That is your soul. And no matter, one thing I've learned about intuition recently, no matter how much you want a thing, you have to listen to your intuition. Oh my gosh, because it's saving you so much heartache. It's saving you so much chaos in your life. It's trying to get you back to peace.
Well, it's trying to, because you have to listen at the end of the day. I mean, intuition is great, but if you don't listen to it, well, you pay the price sooner or later. I say that from my own experience.
Do you think we don't listen to intuition because we're so busy trying to get what we want instead of what our soul wants? What our soul knows. Our soul knows the life work that we're supposed to do. We're put here on earth for. But we have a different perspective on the outside. But how do we stay connected to intuition?
Well, by taming the ego for starters. Because the ego is going to often want one thing and your soul is going to want something else. Or your ego is going to steer you in one particular direction, and your intuition and your soul is going to might steer you in the opposite direction. You might, for example, say, oh, I want a new car and I want the latest BMW 6 Series. Now that may well be, if you can afford it, fine. If you can't afford it, but you're going to stretch yourself, put yourself into debt, then that's probably your ego talking to you. If your intuition and your soul is saying, well, yeah, you want that, but do you really need it? Can you really afford it? What are you going to have to perhaps sacrifice to obtain that?
Right.
Yeah, because the ego always wants what's the best, what's shiny, what's pretty, etc. Right?
Yeah.
But what's pretty and shiny and what you may perceive to be the best at the time may not be the best for you at that time.
Right. So the ego wants shiny. What does the soul want?
The soul wants peace. And the soul basically wants to protect you, and your soul wants you to pursue, I believe, your purpose. Because I believe everyone's sent here for a purpose. You don't always find out what that purpose is because other things get in the way, like the ego, or you're not tuned in, and sometimes it's just life. Sometimes, obviously, we've all got to pay bills. We've got to keep a roof over our head. We've got to eat food. So all of those things are pressures. So sometimes it can be very difficult to kind of follow, even if you know what your life path is or you know what your soul mission is. It's not always the easiest path to follow.
Right. It's not, because like you say, life is happening.
Yeah, life. Yeah.
Woo, if you could follow your soul, oh my gosh.
But if you can, but then, I mean, you see, I believe in, even though I'm very kind of science and psychology based, but I'm also very spiritual as well. And I'd say spiritual in the sense of spiritual, not in the sense of religion.
Absolutely.
Because I have been a researcher, I could talk to you about the history of Christianity all day and all night. But in terms of spirituality, I believe everyone has a soul. I've studied astrology, I've studied numerology, and even though people will say astrology is Greek, it's actually African in origin. So it's called soul science. Same with numerology. So these esoteric spiritual sciences are actually African in origin. And I've tested them. I've tested them on myself. I've tested them on other people. I've done astrology charts, numerology charts for other people. And I for free, I don't charge. Because I'm testing the system. So I'll say, okay, tell me what you think. Give me marks out of 10. Usually I've never got less than 7. Usually 8 or 9 in terms of accuracy. And looking at myself, so I know those sciences, those spiritual sciences work. But for me, in numerology, I'm what they call a 2810. And my mission is basically to serve others. That's part of my mission. But in that book, the book's called The Life You Were Born to Live. It's by Dan Millman. And what he says in there, you may well have a soul mission, but your soul mission is not necessarily the easiest thing that's to do.
Right.
Because as you said, life happens.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you so much. You've given us so much valuable information today. Our guests are going to be able to access your book on the show notes. And some more information about Nigel Beckles will be available. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great time.
All right. Until next time. So friends, I hope today's episode was food for your soul and fuel for your life. You can go to anywhere you're listening to this podcast and find out more on our guests. Please rate, share, subscribe to this podcast on any platform. I am your host, KK Smith, and remember, you can always celebrate wins and get back up again inside the Mom Stuff Coffee Shop.